When Keanu Reeves stepped onto the brightly lit set of The Real Talk with Daniel Foster, the audience was buzzing with excitement. They expected another heartfelt, insightful interview, perhaps a few touching stories, some deep reflections, and, of course, the trademark humility that made Keanu a beloved figure. But tonight was different. Daniel Foster wasn't interested in admiration. He thrived on confrontation, on pushing his guests into corners they couldn't escape. With a practiced smirk, he shuffled his cue cards, his mind already calculating the best moment to strike. The cameras rolled, the tension in the studio thickened, and the moment arrived. What Daniel didn't know was that the trap he had so carefully set would soon collapse on him instead. Keanu's response wouldn't just silence the room, it would turn the tables in a way no one, least of all Daniel, had anticipated. Los Angeles, the night before the interview. The city's usual energy pulsed through the streets, flashing billboards, impatient honking, hurried footsteps. But inside Keanu Reeves' quiet home, time seemed to move slower. The dim light from a single lamp cast shadows on the walls as he stood in his kitchen, rolling up the sleeves of his black shirt. He had spent the afternoon in rare solitude, enjoying the silence. Then, his phone vibrated against the countertop. A call. Keanu glanced at the screen, his agent, Mark Henderson. Mark. Keanu's voice was calm as he picked up. Keanu, we need to talk. You just got an invite to appear on The Real Talk with Daniel Foster. Keanu leaned against the counter, rubbing his jaw thoughtfully. The name was familiar. Daniel Foster, a talk show host notorious for his aggressive style, his ability to twist words into weapons. His interviews had destroyed reputations, shattered careers. Interesting, Keanu mused, a small smile playing on his lips. Interesting? Keanu, this guy is a vulture, Mark shot back, exasperation creeping into his tone. He doesn't just interview people, he sets them up. He waits for them to slip, then rips them apart for headlines. I wouldn't trust this for a second. Keanu chuckled softly. So you think I'll slip? Mark let out a heavy sigh. That's not the point. The point is, he wants to use you. He'll find something, anything, to twist into controversy. You don't need this kind of stress. Keanu considered the warning. Mark wasn't wrong. Foster was ruthless, a master at turning casual remarks into viral scandals. But Keanu wasn't like most celebrities. I'll do it. There was a pause. Then, a groan from Mark. You're serious? Yeah. Another pause. Then, reluctantly, fine. But just, be careful, alright? Something about this feels off. Keanu appreciated the concern, but his mind was already made up. He wasn't walking into a lion's den. He was the lion. Behind the scenes of The Real Talk. Inside a sleek, glass-walled production room, Daniel Foster stood in front of a large screen, reviewing clips from past interviews. Around him, his team of producers and researchers murmured among themselves, exchanging notes and ideas. On the screen was Keanu Reeves, smiling, waving to fans, effortlessly cool. The internet's favorite celebrity. The untouchable. Daniel's eyes gleamed with something almost predatory. This is it, he said, pausing the video. Keanu freaking Reeves. One of the producers hesitated. Target? Daniel smirked. Come on. Every guest has a weak spot. Even him. People love Keanu, sure. But that's exactly why we need to challenge him. If we can get him to say something, anything, controversial, it'll be everywhere. Viral in seconds. A younger researcher scrolled through a tablet, frowning. But what's his weak spot? Daniel leaned back, crossing his arms. He plays the humble, kind-hearted guy role. But nobody's that perfect. If we dig deep enough, we'll find contradictions. Another producer shifted uncomfortably. And if we don't? Daniel's smirk widened. Then we create them. A heavy silence settled over the room. Daniel tapped his fingers against the desk, his excitement barely contained. This wasn't just another interview. This was a calculated storm. But what Daniel didn't know was that storms don't always go the way you expect. Meanwhile, in his quiet home, Keanu scrolled through the online reactions to the upcoming interview. Speculation ran wild. Fans expressed excitement, but some were wary. They knew Foster's reputation. Keanu wasn't surprised. He wasn't nervous. He was just waiting. Because what Daniel Foster didn't realize was that this time, he was the one walking into a trap. The streets of Los Angeles pulsed with their usual late-night energy, horns blaring, neon lights flickering, hurried pedestrians weaving through traffic. But inside Keanu Reeves' car, silence reigned. He sat in the back seat, staring out the tinted window as the city blurred past. His expression was unreadable, a quiet storm beneath an ocean of calm. Beside him, his agent Mark was anything but calm. His foot tapped anxiously against the car floor, his fingers fidgeting against his knee. "We can still turn around," Mark muttered, sneaking a glance at Keanu. Keanu turned his head slightly, a smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. "You say that as if I'm walking into a battlefield." Mark scoffed. "You might as well be. Daniel Foster doesn't interview people, Keanu. He dismantles them. He sets them up, twists their words, and, if you give him even a second of hesitation, boom. You're the next viral headline." Keanu's smirk didn't fade. "So you don't trust me to handle it?" Mark exhaled sharply, rubbing his temple. "I trust you. I don't trust him." Keanu leaned back against the seat, folding his arms. "Then let's see how he handles someone who doesn't play his game." The car slowed to a stop in front of the Real Talk studio. The moment Keanu stepped out, a wave of flashing cameras erupted like a storm. Reporters shouted from behind barricades, "Keanu, any thoughts before the interview? Are you ready for Foster's questions?" Keanu didn't break stride. He offered only a small, knowing smile before disappearing inside. Backstage at the Real Talk studio, the Real Talk set was a well-oiled machine, a maze of crew members moving swiftly, earpieces buzzing, producers whispering into microphones. There was tension in the air, an unspoken anticipation for what was about to unfold. Backstage, a group of producers gathered around the monitors, watching Keanu's arrival. "This could backfire," one muttered under his breath. "Daniel's been cocky before, but this is Keanu Reeves." Another producer crossed his arms. "Yeah. And? They all break eventually." A third producer, the youngest of the team, hesitated. "Not him." Daniel Foster, however, had no such doubts. In his private dressing room, he adjusted his tie in the mirror, a confident smirk playing on his lips. Behind him, his lead producer checked the final preparations. "Everything's ready?" Daniel asked without turning around. "Yes. The talking points are set, the live audience is hyped, and we've already seeded some questionable tweets about Keanu to stir controversy. People will be watching." Daniel's smirk widened. "Perfect. Now all I have to do is set the trap, and let him walk right into it." Lights, camera, action. The Real Talk studio glowed under cool blue lighting. The set was sleek, modern. At the center, two chairs sat across from each other, one for Daniel, one for Keanu. The murmuring audience quieted as the director counted down. Live in 3, 2, 1, the Real Talk intro music played. The audience erupted in applause as Daniel Foster strode onto the stage, flashing his signature grin. "Welcome, everyone. Tonight, we have a very special guest. A Hollywood legend. A man who has starred in some of the biggest films of our time and has somehow remained one of the most beloved celebrities on the planet." The audience clapped even louder. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome, Keanu Reeves. The applause swelled as Keanu walked onto the stage. Effortless. Relaxed. He shook Daniel's hand, nodded to the crowd, then settled into his seat with the calmness of someone who had already won the game before it had even begun. Daniel, still grinning, leaned forward. Keanu, thank you for being here. Keanu gave a polite nod. Thanks for having me. Daniel crossed his leg over the other, settling into his persona, the charming host, the sharp-witted commentator, the man who always had the last word. You know, Keanu, you have a bit of a mythical reputation, don't you? Keanu raised an eyebrow. Do I? Daniel chuckled. Oh, come on. The internet calls you the nicest guy in Hollywood. Every time we hear about you, it's some new act of generosity, donating millions, giving up your seat on the subway, helping strangers. Do you ever get tired of being seen as too good to be true? The audience chuckled. A few whispers spread through the room. Keanu took a slow breath, then answered simply, I don't think kindness should ever be exhausting. The audience clapped. Murmurs of approval rippled through the studio. Daniel's smile tightened ever so slightly. He continued, but let's be honest. No one is that perfect, right? Isn't it possible that Hollywood has built a narrative around you? Something a little exaggerated? Keanu gave a small shrug. I've never asked for a narrative. I just try to live in a way that feels right to me. More applause. Daniel's fingers drummed against his chair. Time to push harder. Well, Keanu, we'll get into all of that. But first, let's talk about your career. Daniel shuffled his notes. I mean, John Wick. Huge success. But some critics say the character's motivation, avenging a dog, is almost simplistic. Do you ever worry that your roles rely more on nostalgia than actual depth? A subtle shift occurred in the audience. Keanu, however, remained completely unbothered. I think grief is universal, he said evenly. Losing something you love, whether a person or an animal, can break you. And sometimes, stories don't have to be complicated to be meaningful. The audience applauded again. Daniel's smile flickered. This wasn't working. Keanu wasn't defensive. He wasn't rattled, but Daniel wasn't done yet. He adjusted his notes and looked Keanu directly in the eyes. Alright, Keanu. Let's get into the real conversation. The audience leaned in. Daniel's trap was about to spring that he just didn't realize. The real trap was waiting for him. The studio lights dimmed slightly as the real talk returned from its commercial break. The air was thick with anticipation. The audience leaned forward, sensing the shift in tone. Keanu Reeves sat calmly, his posture relaxed but attentive. Across from him, Daniel Foster smiled, adjusting his cuffs with calculated ease. He was ready for the next phase, the real ambush. Keanu, Daniel began, his voice deliberately measured, you always talk about generosity, about giving back. But some critics say that your donations to hospitals and social programs are just Hollywood's version of performative activism. A way to push an agenda under the guise of charity. Silence blanketed the room. The audience tensed. The crew behind the cameras exchanged glances. Daniel waited. He expected a moment of hesitation, a flicker of discomfort. A chance to pounce, but Keanu didn't hesitate. He didn't fidget. Instead, he smiled, not a nervous smile. Not a defensive one. A calm, knowing smile. Kindness has no ideology, he said simply. The audience broke into applause. Daniel blinked. That wasn't what he expected. Keanu leaned forward slightly, his gaze unwavering. Helping others isn't a political act, he continued. It's a human one. The idea that generosity needs to be categorized as left or right, liberal or conservative, that's a distraction. The world already has enough division. If I can help someone, I will. No strings attached. The applause grew louder. Backstage, a producer whispered nervously into a headset, this isn't going the way Daniel planned. Daniel licked his lips, quickly scanning his notes. He had one last card to play, one final question designed to shake Keanu's unbreakable composure. "Let's take a quick break," Daniel said, forcing a smile. "Because after this, I have a question I think you'll find difficult to answer." The screen faded to black, the audience murmured. Keanu remained completely still, because he knew Daniel wasn't setting a trap, that he was walking into one. The final strike. When the show returned, the tension in the studio was more palpable than ever. Daniel's smirk returned as he shuffled his cue cards one last time. This was it. His moment. "Keanu, let's talk about something deeper." Keanu raised an eyebrow, waiting. "Your reputation in Hollywood is unique. You're seen as someone who rejects excess, avoids the spotlight, chooses humility over indulgence." Daniel let his words hang in the air for effect before continuing. "And yet, that's exactly what makes people skeptical." A few murmurs rippled through the audience. Keanu tilted his head slightly. "Skeptical?" Daniel's fingers tapped lightly against his chair. "Nobody's perfect. And yet, you're treated as if you are. The internet loves you. People call you the last good guy in Hollywood. But isn't that just another illusion? Another performance?" The audience murmured again. This was the real strike, the one that planted doubt. Daniel framed it carefully. It wasn't an outright accusation. It was a question. One that forced Keanu to respond on the defensive, but Keanu didn't flinch. He simply nodded thoughtfully before replying. "Authenticity isn't something you prove," he said. "It's something you live." Daniel's smirk wavered slightly. Keanu continued. "The way people see me isn't in my control. But I've never tried to be perfect. I've only tried to be decent." A light applause rippled through the studio. Daniel shifted in his seat. He wasn't going to let Keanu win the room so easily. His smile returned, but this time, there was something sharper behind it. "That's a nice sentiment, Keanu. But let's be honest." Daniel leaned forward. "Hollywood is built on image. Whether you like it or not, you have one too. And that image? It comes with expectations." Keanu didn't respond immediately. He let Daniel continue. "People expect you to be the good guy," Daniel pressed. "But isn't that exhausting? Never making a mistake? Always being the humble, selfless actor?" Keanu exhaled softly. "I think you're misunderstanding something." Daniel's smirk faltered. "Oh?" Keanu leaned forward slightly, his eyes steady. "Being kind isn't about meeting expectations. It's just about doing what feels right. If people respect that, great. If they don't, that's fine too." Daniel tried to cut in, but Keanu wasn't done. "But the moment you start doing good things just to be seen as a good person, that's when it stops being real." The audience reacted instantly. A mix of nods, murmurs, and light applause spread through the room. Daniel felt it, the control of the conversation slipping, just slightly. He needed to push further. "Okay, Keanu. Let's talk about something specific." Keanu waited. "You're known for donating large amounts of money. Hospitals. Education programs. Charities. But some critics argue that charity isn't always the answer. That giving people money doesn't solve deeper systemic problems." Keanu's expression didn't change, but the room's energy shifted. Daniel pressed on. "Isn't it fair to say that your donations, while generous, are more of a temporary fix? A way to feel good, rather than actually change anything?" A slight murmur spread through the audience. It was a subtle attack. One that suggested Keanu's generosity wasn't as noble as it seemed. But Keanu, as always, didn't take the bait. He thought for a moment before answering. "Helping someone in need doesn't mean you've fixed the entire system. But it means you've helped someone." Daniel blinked, caught off guard by how simple, yet effective, the response was, Keanu continued. I don't donate to change the world overnight. I donate because someone, somewhere, needs help today. The audience broke into applause. Daniel quickly interjected before it could grow stronger. But don't you think true empowerment is about teaching people to be self-sufficient, not just handing out money? Keanu gave a small smile. You assume those two things are separate. Daniel hesitated. Keanu leaned back slightly. People think of help as a transaction. Like giving takes something away. But real generosity doesn't work that way. It's not about control or power. It's about giving, without expecting something back. The applause was louder this time. Even the audience could feel it now. Keanu wasn't falling into any of Daniel's traps, and Daniel knew it. Daniel glanced at the clock. They were running out of time, and Keanu had not stumbled once, which meant it was time for the hardest question of the night. Daniel's tone softened, becoming almost sympathetic. Keanu, you've experienced more tragedy than most people ever will. The audience fell silent. Mark, watching from backstage, tensed. Daniel continued, his voice laced with subtle manipulation. And yet, here you are. Still giving. Still helping. But tell me, does it ever feel fake? A heavy silence settled over the studio. Keanu's expression didn't waver. Daniel leaned in. Isn't it exhausting to pretend like you're okay all the time? The trap was set. Daniel expected Keanu to crack. To admit weakness. To break the illusion of the unshakable good guy, but instead, Keanu smiled, not in amusement. In understanding, and then he answered, simply and honestly, pain doesn't take away kindness. If anything, it makes it more necessary. The audience froze, and for the first time, Daniel Foster had nothing to say. For a moment, the Real Talk studio was silent. The audience, the crew, even Daniel Foster himself, everyone seemed momentarily frozen, processing Keanu's words. Pain doesn't take away kindness. If anything, it makes it more necessary. Keanu's voice had been steady, his expression unchanged. But there was a weight to his words, something raw, something that lingered, and Daniel, for the first time all night, he had nothing to say. He had come into this interview with a plan. A strategy. He had set his traps carefully, waiting for Keanu to slip, to fumble, to reveal a flaw that could be exploited. But instead, Keanu had taken every attack, every leading question, every manipulation, and turned them into moments of clarity. The audience erupted in applause. Daniel swallowed. His grip on his cue cards tightened. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. He needed to regain control. That's an interesting perspective, he said finally, his voice just a little too smooth, a little too forced. Keanu simply nodded. Daniel's mind raced. He was out of time. If he didn't do something now, this entire interview would slip completely out of his grasp, and then he remembered, he had one last move left, his ace in the hole. A question designed to create real controversy. He forced a smile, leaning in slightly. All right, Keanu. Let's talk about something more direct. The audience quieted. Your donations align with certain social policies. Some would even call them wealth redistribution. A deliberate pause, then, the final dagger, a bit socialist, wouldn't you say? A murmur spread through the room. Daniel's smirk returned. This was it. If Keanu agreed, he risked alienating part of his audience. If he denied it, he'd look like he was backtracking. It was a no-win situation. At least, it should have been, but Keanu Reeves didn't play by anyone else's script. He tilted his head slightly. His expression remained neutral. Then, he leaned forward ever so slightly, just enough for the cameras to catch the intensity in his gaze, and then, in a voice as calm as ever, he said, the idea that helping people is political, that's the real problem. The audience inhaled sharply. Daniel's smirk faltered. Keanu continued. Feeding someone who's hungry isn't socialism. It's kindness. A single clap, then another, and then, the entire studio erupted in applause. Daniel's fingers clenched around his cue cards. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. Keanu had walked through every trap. Every twist. Every accusation without a single misstep, and now, Daniel was the one exposed. The moment everything changed, the Real Talk studio felt different now. The set was unchanged. The lights still bright. The cameras still rolling, but Daniel Foster felt the shift. For years, he had mastered the art of trapping guests, of pushing them into viral moments that would make headlines, but tonight, something was different, because Keanu Reeves hadn't played the game, that he hadn't dodged questions. He hadn't gotten defensive. Instead, he had done something far more dangerous, that he had stayed completely in control, and the audience knew it. Daniel forced a chuckle, trying to brush past it. "Well, Keanu, you've certainly given us some thoughtful answers tonight." Keanu, still composed, nodded. "Glad to hear that." Daniel pressed on, desperate to shift the conversation to safer ground. "But let's step away from the serious stuff for a moment. You're one of the biggest stars in the world. What's next for Keanu Reeves?" "A distraction, that a chance to end the show with something light." Keanu smirked slightly. "Hopefully, a quiet dinner after this." The audience laughed. Some of the tension broke, even Daniel chuckled, though it was tight. Forced, Keanu continued. "I have some projects in the works. But honestly, I'm just enjoying the present moment." Daniel nodded, but deep down, he knew, it was over. Keanu wasn't giving him a viral soundbite. There was nothing left to push, and worst of all, Daniel knew it. His eyes flickered toward the audience, searching for something, a reaction, a moment he could seize. But what he saw was worse, because they weren't looking at him anymore. They were looking at Keanu, not just watching, rooting for him. Daniel saw it in their faces: respect, admiration, loyalty. This wasn't just an interview anymore, this was a reckoning. Daniel had tried to expose Keanu. Instead, he had exposed himself. The fallout begins. "Daniel, we're wrapping in 60 seconds. The producer's voice crackled in his earpiece. Daniel swallowed. For the first time in his own studio, he felt small. He forced a final, gracious smile. "Well, Keanu, it's been a pleasure having you on the show." Keanu nodded, warm as ever. "Thanks, Daniel. I appreciate the conversation." Conversation, not a debate, not an interrogation, just conversation. Daniel hated how effortless it sounded. The cameras rolled for the closing line. "That's all for tonight, folks. Thank you for watching." The applause was loud, but it wasn't for Daniel. It was for Keanu. And as Daniel shook Keanu's hand and stepped off the stage, his mind was already racing, because while the show was over, the fallout was just beginning. The internet reacts. The Real Talk theme music played. The credits rolled, but the damage had already been done. Daniel forced a smile as he shook Keanu's hand one last time. "Thanks again, Keanu." Keanu, ever gracious, nodded. "Take care, Daniel." Then, without hesitation, he walked off stage, and that was when Daniel felt it, not just the awkward tension in the room, but the shift happening everywhere. Something was wrong. Daniel barely had time to process the disaster before a producer rushed over, holding up his phone. "Daniel, you need to see this." Daniel took it, his stomach dropping as he saw the endless notifications. Trending #1 worldwide. Keanu destroys. His name was all over social media, and not in the way he wanted. His reputation, the sharp, fearless interviewer who exposed Hollywood's elite, was crumbling in real time. And worse, he wasn't just being mocked. He was being torn apart. Daniel Foster's hands tightened around his phone. His name was everywhere. His social media feed had become a war zone. Tweets, posts, memes. His downfall was unfolding in real time. #Keanu destroys. Daniel was trending worldwide. He scrolled, heart pounding. Daniel Foster tried to trap Keanu Reeves and got destroyed. Absolutely beautiful to watch. Watching Daniel Foster struggle to twist Keanu's words was like watching a kid throw a tantrum after losing a chess match. Keanu proving once again why he's the GOAT. Meanwhile, Foster is done. Keanu didn't just survive the ambush. He made Foster irrelevant. His reputation, the one he had carefully built over years, was crumbling. And then, the worst notification of all. A message from his producer: "Network wants to talk now." Damage control. Daniel stormed into the production office, slamming the door behind him. His lead producer, Lisa Carter, was already waiting, arms crossed. "Okay, what the hell is going on?" he demanded. Lisa exhaled sharply, sliding her phone across the desk. "You tell me, Daniel. The internet is on fire, and they're not on our side." Daniel snatched up the phone and scanned the headlines. Daniel Foster's career killer interview? How Keanu turned the tables. Viewers praise Keanu Reeves for dismantling loaded questions with class. Real Talk host under fire, fans call for show to be cancelled. His stomach twisted. "This is bad, Daniel," Lisa continued. "The network is furious. They expected a viral moment, but not this. You lost control of the interview, and now you look like the villain." Daniel ran a hand through his hair. It was supposed to be a debate. A challenge. Lisa gave him a sharp look. "No, Daniel. It was supposed to be entertainment. And right now, the only person entertaining the audience is Keanu Reeves." A tense silence hung between them. Then, Lisa's phone buzzed again. She checked the message, her expression darkening. "You're not gonna like this." She turned the screen toward him. A post from Real Talk's official account: "We do not endorse personal attacks or attempts to manipulate guests. We appreciate all feedback and will be reviewing our approach moving forward." Daniel's blood ran cold. The show was distancing itself from him. Lisa's voice was eerily calm. "They're hanging you out to dry, Daniel." Meanwhile, Keanu moves on across the city. Keanu Reeves sat in the back of a quiet restaurant, a steaming cup of tea in front of him. His phone buzzed with notifications, but he barely glanced at them. Mark, his agent, sat across from him, grinning as he scrolled through social media. "You know, I should be used to this by now," Mark said. "But man, you really just effortlessly walked through that interview like it was a morning meditation." Keanu chuckled, stirring his tea. "It wasn't about winning, Mark." Mark smirked. "Tell that to the internet. Because as far as they're concerned, you obliterated him." Keanu shook his head lightly. "It's not about proving anyone wrong. It's about staying true to who you are. That's all." Mark watched him for a moment, then sighed. "You know, most people would take a moment to celebrate." Keanu smiled. "I'd rather just enjoy my tea." Mark laughed. "Of course you would." Keanu's phone vibrated again. This time, he glanced at it. A simple text from an old friend: "You handled that with class. Proud of you." Keanu smiled, set his phone down, and took a sip of tea. The world was watching. The internet was buzzing, but Keanu had already moved on. The end of Daniel Foster. Daniel Foster had built his career on controversy, but controversy had a funny way of turning on its creators. The next morning, the headlines were merciless. Daniel Foster's reputation in free fall. Will he recover? Sponsors reportedly pulling ads from Real Talk following backlash. Network executives considering future of the show. Daniel sat in his office, staring blankly at his phone. His inbox was flooded with angry emails. His phone calls were going unanswered. The network was silent. Then, finally, a call. His boss, Daniel, took a deep breath and answered. "Daniel. Sir, I can fix this. We can spin it." A long pause, then, "We'll talk soon." The line went dead. Daniel sank into his chair. For the first time in his career, he wasn't sure if there was a way back. And the worst part, the only person who could have given him advice on how to handle this, was the man who had just destroyed him, Keanu Reeves. Final thoughts: Keanu didn't need to attack. He didn't need to fight. He simply was himself. And in the end, that was enough, because when faced with arrogance, manipulation, and deceit, the quiet strength of authenticity will always win. And Keanu Reeves had already won.